Welcome to another episode of Hames and Henderson Chilliwack Now. I'm Clint Hames, former mayor, and I'm joined as always by Paul Henderson, the editor of the Chilliwack Progress newspaper. On this episode, we're going to chat about something that touches each and every one of us. Our country, and to a large degree the world, is experiencing a period of significant inflation. Whether it's gas, groceries, clothes, everything is costing more. In this episode, we're going to talk about the economy in general terms and the forces that are causing inflation and what we might have in store for us as we move forward. Paul?
And when we come back from this message from our sponsor, Zacharias Vickers, we'll be talking with a couple of guests who have a background in business and the financial services sector to talk about our economy and the impact of inflation.
We are joined today by two guests. Evan Kalynchuk is a senior investment advisor with BMO Nesbitt Burns. Evan's got an MBA and has worked in the financial services industry for the past 25 years. Our second guest is Berris Karden. Berris, of course, people know, is the producer of this show and has also been in the financial services industry for many years and has an MBA as well. So let's get into the first question, and we want to talk about, first of all, inflation. There's a lot of folks, if you read on social media and you get a sense from what people are talking about with respect to inflation, there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding. There's some people feel like inflation is a switch that a prime minister or a president switches because they think it's a good idea for prices to go up. But inflation is a lot more than that. Let's start with you, Berris. How would you describe inflation and what it is and what are its causes? And then we'll get to Evan's thoughts on it.
Yeah, thanks, Clint. I would say that inflation is a general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing value of money. That's what I read on the internet anyway. Basically, inflation is a measurement of what a basket of goods was and services was in the past, and what they are at a certain point in the future or now. And inflation as a measurement will change depending on what that basket of goods looks like. So it's measured by an aggregate average of that basket of goods and services over a period of time. And if it's gone up, it's inflation. Gone down, deflation.
So Evan, what creates it? Why are we in a period right now where inflation is top of mind with everyone?
Yeah, it is a little bit of a perfect storm that we've seen here, not just in Canada, but worldwide over the last couple of years. Demand and supply issues, supply chain issues have really caused a shortage of some goods. And so when you have a shortage of goods and you still have the same level of demand, generally speaking, you can see price increases or inflation in those goods. An example would be something like vehicles. Shortage of vehicles in the last couple of years has been caused by supply chains. Could have a vehicle completely built except for one computer chip and it can't get to the dealership. So therefore that puts pressure on other vehicles or the used vehicle market, so that if that level of demand stays the same or increases, you're still going to cause inflation in that avenue. So it's not just a simple pulling one string. It is a very complex problem. It is a bit of a perfect storm that's caused the level of inflations that we're seeing presently.
Yeah, we're at about 9%. So.
And how much of the problem do you believe was caused by government spending during the pandemic?
Well, governments, what they did do is definitely put a level of support in there, believing that we were going to see an economic downturn caused by COVID. Having come through the storm, if you will, there's probably a lot of sober second thought in terms of the level of support that was provided. Was it too much? Did they go too far? Was money too cheap for too long? And now they're sort of reversing that trend. So definitely an element of it would be how cheap money was, because if money's cheap, costs of borrowing are cheap, generally speaking, consumers will spend more. And so that is adding more to the demand side of the equation.
I think the interesting thing, though, is that we've had a period of low interest rates and low inflation for a generation. And you had that additional demand. People were racking up their cards, but it did not seem to affect inflation. But come the pandemic, and then, as you pointed out, that additional government spending, I think that over a 2-year period, there was that lag effect that was people talked about, like economists talked about, that we're going to be paying for this in the future. Well, the future's now. But even that didn't happen so quickly. It was the invasion of Ukraine and then the oil price shock that I think finally was the straw that broke the camel's back in this particular case.
And prices like oil and some of those major commodities, they are impacted by more than just reality on the ground. You can simply breathe oil shortage, or we're not going to drill as much, or we're not going to take as much out of the ground, and the prices rocket up immediately. If only they came down as quickly as they go up.
And it impacts every sector of the economy, because it's not only energy for transportation or burning or whatever. It's in plastics. The flow it punches way above its weight compared to what that commodity is, just because it's used absolutely everywhere.
Interestingly, what I read is, despite this, the oil companies are making more money than they've ever made. So the cost of delivering that product hasn't really changed that much. Just the value they're getting for it has changed. So they're making a bit more money. So,
well, yeah, digging it out of the ground has probably not changed. The price has not changed all that much. It's certainly not doubled in price. But even if it had, the retail price is much more magnified than that cost of producing anyway.
Yeah, some of your inputs may have gone up. You might have inflation in terms of wages.
Yeah.
And you're seeing that play out not just in the energy patch, but in certainly every other industry as well. So something as broad-based as energy, it does impact everything. It impacts all of your inputs. So it doesn't matter whether you're a baker, a butcher, or a candlestick maker. The reality is that if you're transporting, if you're having to hire staff, inflationary pressures definitely can impact your business and your bottom line.
absolutely.
Well, keep in mind, 10 years ago, the concern was deflation and negative interest rates. Like there's countries even now, Japan and Switzerland, that still have negative interest rates. So, and I checked, and their inflation rates are really moderate, under 2% or so. But that was the concern, that we were not growing the real economy. So to be here now, 10 years later, is a bit of a shock. No one really saw that coming. I think, but for COVID, I truly believe that was a catalyst, because it felt like a Goldilocks economy. Low interest rates, low inflation, and good economic growth generally.
It's always, to the non-sort of financial expert, it always just seems like such a complicated balance of, to me at least, of we want people spending, we want an economy, we want a GDP, but when they spend too much, it grows too much. And what level is it the government have any control over it? I mean, we talked about this before briefly, but like everyone blames the government. A lot of it is just the nature of capitalism. So what role does the government really have?
The government has a couple different roles. One, in terms of setting central bank policy around interest rates. Mm-hmm. So we talked about supply money being cheap. That's something that the government controls through the overnight rate. So we got to a low of basically a quarter point throughout COVID, and then we've seen that reverse itself now. Sort of the interworkings of that, or the thought process, is that as you raise that cost of borrowing, generally consumers will spend less because things are costing more to acquire. Mm-hmm. So if you're financing the purchase of a vehicle and that cost of financing goes from 1% to 4%, you might rethink that purchase. Mm. So that really is a way of dampening the economy, dampening demand to a degree. And the reverse is true as well. If governments feel that there is going to be an economic downturn, if you look at early days of COVID, that was the thought process, and so we saw interest rates come down to try to support economic growth throughout COVID. So there is a bit of ebb and flow that can happen. That's kind of the core purpose that the central banks play in trying to find that balancing act between wanting the economy to grow, but as you said, not having it grow to a point where we're causing this overheating of the economy.
I know you're going to go to fiscal policy, but I just wanted to ask you a question. So 0.25% was the overnight rate
Yep.
for a while. And what is it now? Do you know what that rate
Yeah,
is?
2.25 is the overnight rate currently. Yeah.
So it went up like ninefold within a few months, which is, I mean, it doesn't feel like a lot, but relatively speaking, when everyone's used to rates that are so low, it's a huge increase percentage-wise. You got up ninefold, so it's quite interesting.
And it impacts everything, doesn't it? It impacts the cost that governments borrow money at.
Absolutely.
When those rates are going up all around them, whatever government wants to, however government wants to raise money, it's paying more for it as well. And I don't think people understand that the central bank in Canada or the Fed in the United States, these are institutions that are separate from government. They don't phone up the prime minister or the president and say, what do you think the bank rate should be? Although in the United States there were times when the president felt like he should be able to do that.
Not supposed to, yeah.
Pure polyamorous.
But it is something that's completely separate, and those people are put in charge of the economy through that process. That's correct in Canada and the United States.
Correct. Yeah, they are related but separate entities. In terms of how they set policy. So to your point, Clint, we're not supposed to see the role of government to be an overlord, if you will, to the central banks. The central banks are supposed to act on their own accordance based on what they're seeing play out in the general economy.
And there, to Paul's point, they're trying to balance the economy somewhere in there so that we see, a small amount of inflation and lower interest rates and keep the GDP up and the growth going. Because high interest rates aren't good for very many people, are they?
There are. Seniors have been hit hard. Having worked in the banking sector previously, when interest rates started going down, people on fixed incomes were saying, well, what do we do now? If you're getting 1% or 2% or less on your money, and you're not keeping up with inflation.
You mean
it's
their
tough.
investments?
Yeah, because you retire, you're 70 years old, and you're getting 10% on your bonds in 1990 or whatever it was. That was pretty good steady income. Well, you're not getting anywhere near that now.
What are the areas of the economy that are hardest hit? I don't know if you would know this off the top of your head, but I know people talk about, of course, going to the grocery store. My wife and I are doing a little bit of remodeling, and all of a sudden the price of a bunch of things that we had given quoted prices for have gone up. Where is it hit hardest?
Well, I think you're seeing it play out in every element of the economy. We talked about something like energy. When energy goes up, whether it's the grocery store that has to transport goods from supplier to the shelves, or whether it's your contractor that has to go pick up that lumber, and that lumber's got to get to the lumber yard. So all of those things are impacted in terms of inflationary pressures.
It's the people at the margins that will suffer the most, though, because they're barely making it, or the people that have just qualified barely for their mortgage, and now their mortgage renewal comes up, and I was paying 2.25% for my 5-year, and now it's 5.5%. Oh my God! Or people in variable rates that are seeing it happen almost immediately.
To that point, I heard a report this morning where Louis Vuitton is doing really well, and demand for Ferrari have never been higher. So there's a strange sort of level at the high end of the market.
It doesn't impact them,
Well, not only does it impact them, it seems to be they seem to be spending more for some reason.
Yeah,
As an anecdote.
Not too many billionaires are worried about the cost of their mortgage.
I guess not.
that's right. Is there anything governments can do at this point? I mean, we know the central bank is playing a role in what's happening, and they're trying to tweak the rates up to reduce this sort of amount of money that's going out there. Is there other things that government can or should be doing? And
This is your fiscal moment, because I cut you off earlier, so you were going to get into fiscal policy.
Yeah. There's a couple different things they can do. One, we've talked about the central banks and kind of the role they play. The other element that they can look at is certainly what can they do to support, as Berris has said, people on the margins. And you can argue that there's been, various degrees of government intervention or support as they've started to go from COVID to, post-COVID. Here in BC, the government would probably argue that the rebate that you received from ICBC is a form of assistance to help pay for energy. At least that's how they framed it. Yeah. So there are things like that you do see where government can take a more active role in trying to support those that are most impacted.
Yeah, and what about the notion, as some folks would say, governments have to stop spending money, and they need to be cutting way back on the amount of money that they're spending. So we need to look at social all of those things. Is that, what impact does that have when government says we're going to spend less money? I guess their need for borrowing goes down, and that impacts the demand, and that has an impact on.
Yeah, well, it's not only on the government side. If the programs go down or the assistant checks aren't as widely distributed, that means there's less money in people's pockets to spend. So demand is just going to crash.
And the economy then starts to shrink.
Recession.
So that's the next topic.
Well, and that really is what they try to avoid, but it's such a hard thing to balance because of there's lags. You can increase the interest rate, but how long will it take for that to impact the inflation? Generally, employment gets affected before inflation gets impacted. So people start losing their jobs because of higher interest rates, because businesses are cutting back or whatever. And so now the governments see the employment rate going up and the inflation rate still relatively high. Maybe it's come down a bit, but a stagflation sort of situation. Yeah. Well, now the government's got to make a decision. Do we stay the course or do we intervene and get the employment numbers back up? If they intervene too early, the employment numbers go back up, but the inflation just sits there treading water. So that's a tough one to time.
Employment is a really interesting subject that may not be directly related to inflation, or maybe it is. But we've got this baby boomer situation going on that again, perfect storm with the pandemic, where people were like, I'm 2 years away, I'm done. And nobody can find workers. Like every industry complaining. Like in my office, coming across my desk, people complain about, like every sector is complaining, like whether it's healthcare or Tim Hortons or everything in between. There's no employees out there. And I don't know, just in terms of the economic big picture, what effect that would have. Theoretically, wages should be going up. People have more choice. What does that leave us?
Well, you said it already. Wages go up. That's inflation right there. Yeah. So there is a direct impact when the employment market is tight. Rates or wages go up, and then so this is the price of everything else.
But where are all these people that the people to do these jobs? I think we still have a lot of poverty. We still have a lot of people that would benefit from employment. There is the thought that baby boomers said we're out, so now there's this big gap and we can't fill it. But is that what's going on? Do we see that? Evan, you got your finger on the pulse of the kind of corporate world out there because you're doing investments all the time. Is that what you're hearing there? That in terms of employment, it's that. There was a time when we said, well, people are just lazy. These are people who nobody wants to work, but that doesn't seem to be right. The baby boomer answer may be the answer. Are you hearing other things?
Yeah, there definitely has been shortage of labor in a multitude of different markets, and the question is, and it still is the question, is where did the people go? Part of it is increase in demand, so there's been more positions created, and some of those positions haven't been filled. Some of it is people deciding to leave industries. If you look at an industry like healthcare, a lot of people just were tired, worn out, due to the stress of COVID, and they decided to leave the industry altogether. And in cases like that, it isn't something where you can just go in and hire a ready replacement the next day. It is a skilled trade. There's education, there's experience that goes into it. So it takes time for these shortages to rectify themselves. It's not something that gets changed overnight. I would argue that probably the lower skilled the job, probably the easier it is to find someone. But again, if there's a lot of those available, you have that limited amount of workers that have their choice of where do they ultimately want to be employed. And so there will still be someone holding the short straw. And that's sort of where we find ourselves right now, where employment's at very close to all-time record lows. So it is a difficult and it's a challenge, and it's not something where it's an easy answer. Is it a matter of bringing in labor, foreign labor coming in that has the skills to be able to do those roles? We saw visas throughout the last couple of years, temporary workers. There wasn't as much movement of those that labor force internationally. So you've had all of these different factors that have kind of played out over the last couple of years that have kind of caused where we are. It took a bit of a perfect storm to get into this, and unfortunately, it's not an easy answer to get out of it. It's going to take time.
That's for sure.
It's interesting. I know you want to take a break.
I do.
I saw the break thing there, but
you've got a producer's eye.
Well, no, just on that, with these shortages, if you think about it, like robotics and that whole industry, it seems like it's sort of been developing and is developing driverless cars. All of that stuff, like there's a shortage of truckers. They're talking about driverless trucks. So I can see a point in the future where some of that demand for labor gets sopped up by that
It seems
industry.
the economy almost always finds a way.
Yeah.
Could robots do this job?
Easily. without
I heard monkeys
question.
could.
Well, on that lovely note, we're going to take just a quick break, acknowledge our sponsor, and then we're going to be coming back with our two guests, Berris and Evan. And I want to touch on the issue of the R word, recession, when we come back. We're back. Paul and I are joined by Evan and Berris, and we've been talking about inflation and our economy generally. And the word we haven't used all that much yet is the R word, the word that we're afraid to speak these days because I think we're probably getting close to recession. So first of all, Evan, what's a recession? What does that mean? You're involved in investments and investment banking and all of those things. What does a recession mean?
Well, the classic definition of a recession is 2 quarters of negative GDP or gross domestic product growth. So essentially, it's a slowing of the economy to the point where that growth is negative measured against previous levels.
And so how does that affect things like people's investments, stocks, those sorts of things? What does a recession mean?
Yeah, so generally recessions are seen as having a negative impact on the investment landscape. If you think about individual companies, individual stocks, if you're growing into a period where you've got slowing sales, you may have increased costs, for example, when interest rates are going up. That generally puts a squeeze on profitability or can put a squeeze on profitability for companies, and that can negatively impact their stock price. So recessions are seen as being more of a negative than a positive when it comes to the investment landscape overall.
Is there anything positive that comes out of a recession? Like I know, like we talk about inflation and interest rates going up. Sometimes seniors really benefit from that when their investments, things that they have invested in, they're getting a better return on because the investments are up. Is there an upside to a recession?
Well, in the current environment, what's happening is we are seeing interest rates increasing to try to control inflation. The spin-off of that is you are seeing fixed income instruments, GICs, those types of instruments, those rates are raising. So if you do have someone who is buying traditionally GICs, definitely they have seen a big increase in what those rates of returns are versus what we've had over the last number of years. Yeah. So that can be positive on the fixed income side, but there is a bit of push and pull that can happen even on that if you are still seeing those inflationary pressures. So if you're getting a 4% rate of return on a fixed income instrument, but inflation's still running at 6%, yeah. In theory, you are still negative over that holding period.
Mm-hmm. Just generally, the population is generally always growing. So the economy should be growing at least to match that. So when you have a recession and negative growth, and if it continues, well, you're going against that. So generally speaking, the economy is getting poorer. So it's not something you want for very long.
What's our history with recessions in the country? I can't remember the last time somebody used that word to describe our economy.
Wasn't 08, wasn't there a recession there?
Last one was a big one. 08 was a recession. You know, depending on, obviously in the U.S. it was felt much more than it was here in Canada due to the nature of it. But yes, Canada did have a minor recession there. There's been a number of recessions that we've had.
Is 82 a big one?
Yeah, there's been some big ones, but there's also a number of minor recessions where, and you know, some argue right now the U.S. may be on the precipice, if not already,
Didn't
recession.
Biden say, no, we're not in a recession? But technically,
in
mathematically, they are.
in an election year, you never
Mathematically,
want to say it because it's a death
But
knell.
by the strict definition.
They have had 2 consecutive quarters of negative
It's just
growth.
the last one was like so close to.
Yeah. So it depends on how close you want to follow that definition.
It's been a long time since we've had a recession. Like typically, they've been much closer. The boom and bust cycle was much more cyclical, and so we really had the 08. But then was there something in 2011 too? Or I vaguely remember under Obama's regime there was a bit of a shakiness. But really, I mean, it was not much. And so you've got this long, protracted growth. Low interest rates, low inflation. It was Goldilocks for a long time. So, I mean, I don't know if COVID hadn't reared its ugly head when it did, would we be even having this episode? I don't know. I don't think so.
I wonder if, given COVID 2 years ago, if you would have thought where we are here right now, maybe it could be a lot worse.
I think so. I wouldn't suggest that what the government did was wrong. Maybe the degree, but it's so hard to predict because they didn't know how long it was going to last. So everyone was in a panic, and the economy was in free fall. Like the markets, they tanked. So
Well, and make no mistake, you were still in a period of a pandemic. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's just appears to be somewhat less severe, so that we're not reading the numbers every day and wondering how many people have died or are in ICU. We're not doing that anymore. But how many of us know somebody today that is sick?
we just have learned how to manage business and life in this pandemic, and a lot to do with the fact that a lot of people have had it, and a lot of people have been multi-vaxxed, so it's taken the edge off for sure.
Yeah, and I think going back to what Paul was talking about, the government stuck a significant amount of money into the economy. Like the deficit that we looked at a couple of years ago was the largest deficit by 3 times in the country's history. The United States was the same way, but they are paring that back because they were considered sort of one-time expenditures. But we still borrowed that money, and it's still we have to pay it back.
Well, and think about this: interest rates go up, and that pool of money that they've borrowed, now they have to pay the interest on that as well. So it's not a position that the government probably wants to be in for all that long, because then the biggest part of their budget, I think, is probably still interest, and it's going to be a bigger percentage now.
Yeah, the carrying costs are high for governments and consumers alike. They're essentially in the same boat. What the government's really trying to do currently is with the level of inflation that we're seeing, they don't want to create a recession, but they also understand that their primary, especially the central banks, their primary concern right now is getting inflation under control. And by raising interest rates and damping the economy, they're trying to engineer a soft landing, which essentially is, bringing the economy down to the point where we see some of the demand decrease and inflationary pressures decrease, but not to the point where we go into this long and protracted recession. And that's the really tough thing about right now, because as Berris, as you said, these things don't happen overnight. They take time to play out. So cause and effect aren't that closely aligned. You can have months in between a raise in interest rates and to see the net effect of that in the general economy. So it's a slippery slope. It's a tricky position.
And people, they want instant fixes. Yeah. So And the government wants an instant fix because there's an election coming up. So, maybe raise the rates again. So then maybe because of the lag effect, that was too much. Oops, now we're in a deep recession. So it's a tightrope.
Yeah, it sure is. So what can people do from an investment perspective, like managing their money if they're a senior with an investment account, or they're just sort of every day trying to make their way in this environment, this economic environment? What are some of the things that people can do to reduce the impact that this inflation cycle has on their lives, that a pending recession might have on their lives, from an investment perspective and from just a kind of daily living perspective?
In terms of, I'll tackle the investment one and a little bit on the daily living. I'll start with the daily living. There's things that people can do just in terms of substituting. So rather than buying brand name goods, maybe you buy no name goods. Yeah. You go to the dollar store rather than a major grocery store to buy paper plates for your kid's birthday. Things like delaying major purchases. If you're doing a bathroom reno and you realize the cost of goods are higher now than they've been in the last couple of years, maybe you say to your wife or partner, let's hold off on that for a bit.
Too late for me.
Me as well.
We're knee deep in it.
It's like, what? This is coming from some experiential point of view.
Yeah. So there's things like that you can do to try to delay costs or minimize costs. From an investment standpoint, certainly reviewing what you hold in your portfolio with your investment advisor is prudent anytime. But there are certain companies that tend to hold up better when we go into recession. So you'll hear things like buy more defensive positions, buy things that are less impacted by inflation. So if you're for example, if you're a major retailer, you're probably able to absorb price pressures a little bit easier than you are if you're a mom and pop's operation. So, look for companies that are able to handle the inflationary pressures better. As you start to go into a recession, same thing. You've got companies that tend to do better in recessions. Things that aren't easily substituted. So, for example, you might be able to not buy that luxury car, but you probably still need to heat your house. So things like utilities tend to hold up well, not that they're recession-proof, but they tend to hold up better because you can't turn the gas all the way off. So you're still going to have to use those suppliers. So those are a couple things that individuals can look at both on their investment portfolio and also their day-to-day living. And
a good solid investment advisor will be able to give people that information. So if you have one and you use one, they're folks that you can turn to.
And I worked with an investment advisor in the past, and because people would phone in a panic when they saw their portfolio going down or dips and things like that. And he said, we build your portfolio so that it can weather these types of events. Yeah. That's why you hire a professional money manager. So you're not having to worry about these things. When should I go into fixed income? When should I go into cash? You don't want to have to make those decisions if you don't know what you're doing. Like, I wouldn't write a newspaper article because I wouldn't know what I was doing. But
it hasn't stopped others. That's true. I'm not thinking of you, Paul, but no. I'm gonna ask Paul a question, because I think recently in the Progress you guys did have an article on what people can do to. I think Berris pointed out to me.
I read it. It was amazing. Chilliwack Progress had some great advice, and you nailed a couple of the things. But basically, looking at what your expenditures are, how much of what you're buying, you can reduce the amounts of what you're buying, and just shopping more economically, non-brand names. Things like that. Well, just simple stuff.
Yeah, things like meal planning seems minor, but like I'm the kind of person who goes to the grocery store every day because I have no idea what I'm going to cook. But people who are organized save hundreds of dollars a month because
how many people are doing skip the dishes or going to restaurants? It's huge, right? So that's all discretionary income. So I think the good news is that because there's so much money being spent in discretionary income, that's easy to pare back. Yeah. Even if vegetables are more expensive at the grocery store, a lot less expensive than going to a restaurant.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are things that people can do. We talked about economic cycles. Is there Is there a length that we usually see these cycles go in, or have we just busted through the norms with this pandemic? What are the, like I used to, in real estate, in this part of the world, we used to have 10-year cycles where real estate would be up and then it would sink back down, and 10 years later it was back where it was again. And you could almost set your watch with those kind of
Back in the
cycles.
days of economics theory, I think it was like 5 years of expansion and 18 months of recession, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So that's all thrown out the window because, we've talked about that already. Like right now, what you've got is this long period of expansion and a recession that kind of came out of nowhere because of the pandemic, in my belief. And then with Russia, who knew Russia was going to invade Ukraine? Well, probably we should have known. We should probably have known that, but that's beside the point. But that sort of just happened, and as we said, perfect storm.
So where are we seeing the markets right now, Evan? Where are they from a year ago in general terms?
Yeah, generally the markets, if you're looking at the stock markets in North America and worldwide, they are down. It depends. Canada has held up better than the U.S. So if you look at the major indices in Canada, the TSX versus whether it's the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ, or S&P 500. Canada
Is that because of resources, though?
It's because of our commodities, yeah.
Because of the oil.
That's right. So, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, obviously we saw a big spike in energy. So we tend to be a bit more involved in the commodity side. So that has helped. Banks, financials have held in fairly well. But generally, I would say over June, we saw a general weakness in the worldwide stock markets. And we've had a bit of a bounce back here in July so far and early August. So we'll see. I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of the push and pull effects that we are seeing, governments raising rates. How is that going to impact inflation? When are we going to see that impact inflation? So there's a lot of uncertainty. And generally speaking, markets don't like uncertainty.
I've got a question. I don't know if anyone would know the answer to this, but generally inflation is being felt to a significant level all over the world in most countries. But then you've got these pockets, and we're interrelated because of trade. But you've got these countries like Japan where no inflation, Switzerland, no inflation. There's these certain countries that have not experienced it yet. And then the other question I have is, we're raising rates, U.S. is raising rates, U.K. is raising rates, and the Eurozone is kind of sitting on its hands, even though they have 8.5% inflation. Do you have an idea what's going on with any of that? Does anybody?
Well, here's what I would say is I don't think anybody knows for certain in terms of how far each individual country has to go. So there is a bit of home bias that each government's going to have in terms of what they think, and it's going to depend too on your interdependency of other nations. How much are you importing? How much are you exporting? What does your economic growth model look like for your country? Japan's had a monetary policy that they've had adopted decades ago and have largely stuck to that regardless of what's happening in the underlying economy. Is it right or is it wrong? Well, you can look at the general growth we've seen in Japan, and there hasn't been any growth.
Yeah, I mean, their stock market was whatever it was in 1987 or whatever, and it's never reached that again, right? So we're talking 35 years later.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a country like Switzerland, which has one major industry, and that's international banking and finance, which is always pretty stable. And, it doesn't seem, the difference between what you borrow and what you pay in interest rates is always the same. So if
they do army knives too.
Well, and the occasional watch.
That's true.
But when that spread is maintained, it doesn't matter what the two numbers are. If that spread is staying fairly equal, you're going to stay pretty close to that. So I hope that we've been able to clear up some of the information gaps that folks might have had about our economy and inflation and recession and the things that are playing out every day in our lives, impacting every bit of our lives in terms of the cost of things that we're acquiring. I want to thank Berris and Evan for spending some time with us today. It's always comforting to know there are people out there with some pretty good answers to some of these questions.
And we want to thank you guys. You guys don't get thanked enough. You guys are awesome. And Evan, wonderful meeting you. I
Yes.
mean, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
As
Thank
I
you
said,
very
I
much,
confess I've known Evan for a few years and respect his opinion on these issues quite a bit. So I was delighted he was able to spend some time with us on Hames and Henderson, Chilliwack Now. We'll see you on our next episode.